Good morning. I'm Bonnie Gardner, co-chair of the Public Affairs Forum of the First Unitarian Universalist Church. Our programs are most Sundays at noon, and they're free and open to the public. If you're interested in our programs, you can go to our church website at www.austinuu.org. Our mission is to nourish the mind and the spirit and serve social justice. Today I'm very happy and honored to introduce our speaker, Jim Cullen, who will be speaking on the Trans-Pacific Partnership, NAFTA on Steroids. Jim is going to talk about the risks posed to American workers by the Trans-Pacific Partnership, to our economy, to our environment, etc. And let me tell you a little bit about Jim's background. He is the editor of the Progressive Populist, which is a twice-monthly journal of politics and economics, based right here in Manchac, Texas. He's a former daily newspaper reporter and was Austin bureau chief for Hearst Newspapers and an associate editor for the Texas Observer in the 1990s. But he then started the Progressive Populist in 1995 with his brothers. And they print the Populist at their twice-weekly newspaper in Storm Lake, Iowa. And you can go to his website at populist.com or follow Jim on Twitter at Jim Cullen, C-U-L-L-E-N. Let's give Jim a warm welcome. Jim?
Thank you, Bonnie, for that introduction. And if I'm the last speaker of the year, it's an honor to ring out the 2015 with the Unitarian Universalist. As he said, the topic is the Trans-Pacific Partnership, NAFTA on Steroids. The United States has been working to relax trade rules for more than 40 years in an effort to make the world safe for multinational corporations. And it's been a turbulent ride for workers, public health advocates, and environmental and social justice activists. A key to the trade initiatives is Fast Track Trade Promotion Authority, which was originally conceived by President Richard Nixon in 1974 to minimize public debate and congressional oversight of efforts to liberalize trade rules. And in this case, liberalize isn't necessarily a good thing. Fast Track has been used 16 times since then, often to enact controversial trade pacts such as the North American Free Trade Agreement in 1993 and establishment of the World Trade Organization in 1994. Both those deals were begun under President George H.W. Bush, but they were completed and passed through Congress by President Bill Clinton. The deals made it easier to move manufacturing jobs out of the United States. They also lowered trade barriers to let foreign manufacturers export their goods into the USA. Fast Track allows the executive branch to unilaterally select partner countries for trade pacts, negotiate their contents, and sign the agreements and then submit them to Congress. Both the House and Senate are required to vote the agreement up or down without amendments within 90 days of the official submission. The newest deal is the Trans-Pacific Partnership, an agreement with 12 Pacific nations, including the United States. President Obama views it as an important part of his trade legacy. But for many critics, the TPP looks like a replay of NAFTA and the WTO, relaxing trade barriers and empowering multinational corporations without putting in place enforceable regulations to protect labor, the environment, and local government sovereignty. These free trade deals have resulted in the loss of millions of manufacturing jobs to low-wage countries in the third world. And progressives are properly suspicious that free trade is practically the only Obama policy initiative that Republicans support, as the Republican Congress greased the skids this past summer for an up or down vote under special rules that do not allow filibusters or amendments. When NAFTA was put to Congress by President Clinton, in 1993, opponents argued that NAFTA would launch a race to the bottom in wages, destroy hundreds of thousands of good U.S. jobs, undermine democratic control of domestic policymaking, and threaten health, environmental, and food safety standards. NAFTA promoters, including many of the world's largest corporations, promised it would create hundreds of thousands of new high-wage U.S. jobs, raise living standards in the U.S., Mexico, and Canada, improve environmental conditions, and transform Mexico from a poor developing country into a booming new market for U.S. exports. NAFTA was a radical experiment. Never before had a merger of three nations with such radically different levels of development been attempted. Plus, until NAFTA, trade agreements only dealt with the cutting tariffs and lifting quotas to set the terms of trade in goods between countries. But NAFTA contained 900 pages of one-size-fits-all rules, to which each nation was required to conform all of its domestic laws, regardless of whether voters and their elected representatives had previously rejected the very same policies in Congress, state legislatures, or city councils. Over the past 21 years, Public Citizens Global Trade Watch noted, a series of trade agreements have put free trade rules in 20 nations. They not only have failed to meet their corporate and political backers' glowing promises of job creation, instead they have contributed to unprecedented and unsustainable trade deficits, the net loss of nearly 5 million U.S. manufacturing jobs, and more than 55,000 factories, the offshoring of higher-wage service sector jobs, flat median wages despite significant productivity gains, and the worst U.S. income inequality in the last century. Even for U.S. agriculture, a sector that consistently has been promised gains from trade pacts, U.S. food exports have stagnated, while U.S. food imports have surged under NAFTA-style deals. Given that the Trans-Pacific Partnership expands on the same model, opposition in Congress and among the public is deep and broad. The United States has a $178 billion goods trade deficit with its 20 free trade agreement partners. The U.S. trade deficit with FTA partners has surged 427% since the pacts took effect, as imports have ballooned and exports to free trade partners actually have lagged behind exports to the rest of the world. Even eliminating trade in fossil fuels, the United States has a trade deficit of more than $92 billion with its NAFTA partners. In contrast, the United States had a small surplus with Mexico and a $30 billion deficit with Canada before NAFTA. A 2011 study found that the ballooning trade deficit with Mexico under NAFTA resulted in the net loss of about 700,000 U.S. jobs. More than 850,000 specific U.S. jobs have been certified as NAFTA casualties under the U.S. Department of Labor's Trade Adjustment Assistance Program. The U.S. trade deficit with China has grown from $112 billion in 2001, when China joined the World Trade Organization with U.S. congressional approval, to $350 billion today, spurring an estimated 3.2 million U.S. job losses. U.S. manufacturing workers who lose jobs to trade and find reemployment are typically forced to take pay cuts. 3 of every 5 displaced manufacturing workers who were rehired in 2014 took home smaller paychecks, and 1 in 3 lost more than 20%, according to Department of Labor data. NAFTA also displaced millions of Mexicans, many of whom ended up crossing the border into the United States in search of opportunity. U.S. agribusiness dumped corn and other grains in Mexico, undercutting Mexican peasant farmers. These campesinos throughout Mexico lost a significant source of income, and many left their small corn farms. Some became farm laborers working for poverty wages on large plantations growing produce for export to the U.S. Others were drawn to the border with the United States, seeking jobs in maquiladora factories as well as narcotics trafficking and other opportunities across the border. And as many of these maquiladora factories have now lost their business overseas to China or Vietnam, that just displaces more workers right on the border, and that's where you can attribute a large source of our excess undocumented immigrants today. Ironically, staple food prices in Mexico, such as tortillas, rose even as the price paid to Mexican corn farmers dropped 48%. The Trans-Pacific Partnership dates back to 2002 when Chile, New Zealand, and Singapore started talking about trade liberalization. More nations joined the talk, including U.S. in September 2008 during George W. Bush's administration. Participant nations hoped to wrap up the pact in 2012, but contentious issues such as agriculture, intellectual property, and services and investments dragged out the negotiations. As of 2014, 12 countries in the Asia-Pacific region participated in negotiations. They included Australia, Brunei, Canada, Chile, Japan, Malaysia, Mexico, New Zealand, Peru, Singapore, the U.S., and Vietnam. And China and South Korea reportedly are considering joining TPP. Global Trade Watch noted that the TPP would expand the NAFTA model that has spurred massive U.S. trade deficits and job loss. TPP expands NAFTA's protections for firms that offshore U.S. jobs, and U.S. negotiators used the 2011 Korea trade deal, under which exports have fallen and trade deficits have surged, as a template for the TPP. Global Trade Watch Director Lori Wallach called the TPP NAFTA on steroids. Although it is called a free trade agreement, the TPP is not just about trade. Of the pact's 29 chapters, only 5 deal with traditional trade issues. One chapter would provide incentives to offshore jobs to low-wage countries. Many would impose limits on government policies that we rely on to maintain safe food, a clean environment, and more. Our domestic, federal, state, and local policies would be required to conform with TPP rules. Congress cleared the way for approval of the Trans-Pacific Partnership in June, before the text of the deal was released, when the House narrowly approved the Trade Promotion Authority, which is designed to make it easier to pass trade deals during the next 6 years. Earlier in the Senate, the key vote was 62 to 38 on cloture, which required 60 votes to proceed. Voting to keep up the filibuster against President Obama and the Republican majority were 31 Democrats, 2 Democrat-leaning independents, including Senator Bernie Sanders from Vermont, and 5 Republicans: Susan Collins of Maine, Mike Lee of Utah, Rand Paul of Kentucky, Jeff Sessions of Alabama, and Richard Shelby of Alabama. Both Texas senators, John Cornyn and Ted Cruz, voted to give President Obama the authority to negotiate away American sovereignty when it comes to disputes with corporations over regulation of the environment, labor, and markets. This is virtually the only issue on which Cornyn and Cruz have agreed with Obama. And in this case, it makes it easier for corporations to bypass American courts and regulatory agencies and instead take their complaints to an international tribunal whose decision cannot be appealed to American courts. 13 Democrats sided with 48 Republicans to clear the way for the fast-track bill. And 3 of them, Democratic Senators Michael Bennet of Colorado, Patty Murray of Washington, and Ron Wyden of Oregon, are up for re-election in 2016. Leo W. Gerard, president of the United Steelworkers, said after the vote, "Bad votes will be remembered. But while they may be remembered, Labor will need the votes of Bennett, Murray, and Wyden in the next Congress as Democrats hope to regain control of the Senate." The House voted 218 to 208 on June 18th to approve the fast-track Trade Promotion Authority. Lloyd Doggett was the only Austin area congressman who voted against the fast-track provision, as Republicans, again, voted to give Obama the extraordinary authority. The Obama administration finally released the text of the proposed Trans-Pacific Partnership November 5th. It amounted to more than 1,000 pages of text, much of it legalese that is practically incomprehensible to laymen. President Obama's assurances that the deal protects American workers and consumers and opens new markets in the Pacific Rim has provided little comfort to organized labor, environmentalists, public health advocates, and consumer activists who have dived into the text. Winona Houter, executive director of the Food and Water Watch, said the TPP is a giveaway to big agribusiness and food companies that want to use trade deals to attack sensible food safety rules, weaken the inspection of imported food, and block efforts to strengthen U.S. food safety standards. The TPP gives the food industry a powerful new weapon to wield against the nationwide movement to label GMO foods, Houter said. The language in the TPP is more powerful and expansive than other trade deals that have already been used to weaken or eliminate dolphin-safe tuna and country of origin labels. The National Farmers Union said the deal will fail family farmers and ranchers. After years of negotiating in secret for an enormous agreement guarded from the public under lock and key, the text of the TPP has at last been made public. Unfortunately, it appears to be as bad for America's family farmers and ranchers as we had feared, Farmers Union President Roger Johnson said. There are persistent questions about the constitutionality of the pact. Many critics say it should be considered as a treaty among nations, which would require approval of two-thirds of the Senate. Others question the TPP's authority to bypass U.S. courts and overrule state and local laws in trade disputes. For example, the pact allows foreign investors to bring claims for money damages when governments violate the TPP's investor protection provisions. The claims are decided by a private arbitration tribunal that operates outside the challenged government's court system. The tribunal could order the government to compensate corporations for lost expected profits, and the tribunal's decision could not be appealed to U.S. courts. Dave Johnson, who has been following the trade negotiations for the Progressive Campaign for America's Future, wrote in September, when portions of the agreement were leaked, that the TPP terms appear to be even worse for the U.S. than NAFTA. Under NAFTA, 62.5% of the value of cars and 60% of auto parts had to be made in NAFTA countries, or a tariff would apply. But under the proposed TPP, the deal appears to say that only 45% of cars and 30% of parts need to be made in TPP countries, and the rest of that business could go to other non-TPP countries, such as China, with low wages, low labor standards, and low environmental protections. The result will be a huge shift of jobs and businesses away from American, Mexican, and Canadian auto and parts makers, Johnson said. Canada's Globe and Mail reported that Canada's auto parts makers, who employed 81,000 workers, say the text of the agreement shows the local content protections for vehicle components are significantly skimpier than the former conservative government had advertised. Local content requirements for important vehicle components would be between 40% and 45%, and engine parts and such body stampings as truck frames and metal roof panels will only be required to have TPP content of 35%. Kevin L. Kearns, president of the U.S. Business and Industry Council, which represents family-owned and closely held U.S. manufacturing companies, called the TPP agreement a very bad deal for America, and said apparently one of America's biggest economic problems is that Toyota does not sell enough cars and trucks here, and thus does not displace enough American jobs. The TPP deal allows Toyota and other Japanese automakers a special concession to keep their global supply chains intact. So the president's singling out of auto workers as benefiting from TPP was unfortunate. They do not, and American auto workers will be hit hard as production is expected to move to China. The TPP also would allow currency manipulation to continue, do nothing to prevent state-owned enterprises from receiving state support and protection, and allow foreign workers to continue to suffer violations of their rights, the United Steelworkers said. So it looks like TPP does anything but putting American workers first. If anything, it puts them first in line to be laid off. Recent actions of the World Trade Organization also undermine assurances by President Obama that the TPP would not threaten domestic regulations. The World Trade Organization recently authorized trade sanctions of up to $1 billion a year against the U.S. if we don't get rid of country of origin meat labels, also known as COOL, that we rely on to make informed choices about our food, Public Citizens Global Trade Watch noted. The edict followed just 2 weeks after the WTO ordered the U.S. to roll back the dolphin-safe tuna labeling policies that allow us to make sure that the tuna we buy is caught in ways that do not kill dolphins. Melanie Foley of Global Trade Watch noted that President Obama, speaking at Nike headquarters in May, rejected critics' warnings that the TPP or any trade pact could undermine American regulation, food safety, worker safety, even financial regulations. It's just not true, Obama said, accusing the critics of making this stuff up. No trade agreement is going to force us to change our laws. But these WT rulings prove yet again that trade agreements can undermine even the most popular U.S. consumer and environmental safeguards. And the TPP would open up more of these threats and even empower foreign corporations to directly attack our laws. The Cool case isn't the first trade pact attack on our laws. Foley noted that after losing past trade challenges, the U.S. rolled back gasoline cleanliness standards, protections for sea turtles, and vehicle fuel efficiency requirements. The TPP also creates extreme monopoly rights for global pharmaceutical companies and gives them more power to drive up costs for Medicare and public health programs in all TPP countries. Celeste Drake, Trade and Globalization Policy Specialist at the AFL-CIO, wrote that these rules are far worse for working families than comparable rules in the Peru, Colombia, and Panama deals negotiated by then-President George W. Bush. The TPP will raise drug prices for families across the region. That's regressive, not progressive, Drake wrote. Perhaps the best we can hope for is that right-wing Republicans will find themselves unable to swallow the deal. Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell has said that President Obama should not submit TPP to Congress for a vote before the November 2016 election. The Hill newspaper in D.C. Reported that while McConnell has expressed support in the past for trade, he has warned the White House not to target tobacco growers in a final deal. The deal includes a provision that gives countries more power to regulate manufactured tobacco products, such as cigarettes, as part of any efforts to protect public health. The White House has argued that the tobacco provisions are narrowly focused on health issues and don't affect the trade of the tobacco relief. But the move has already led to the loss of Republican votes on both sides of the Capitol. Republicans are similarly upset that TPP doesn't grant a long enough monopoly to pharmaceutical companies, thereby rigging the rules so they can charge astronomical, excessive, rent-seeking, impoverishing prices. According to the Washington Post, Senator Orrin Hatch, Republican from Utah, has been concerned about provisions that would offer pharmaceutical companies that develop next-generation biologic drugs about 8 years of protection for intellectual property, and that's 4 years fewer than is currently available under U.S. laws. But Dave Johnson at Campaign for America's Future noted that the TPP grants these companies an 8-year monopoly on their products, in which time they can charge whatever they want anywhere that TPP is enforced. 8 years, but that isn't enough rule rigging for them. Don't let these conservative politicians pretend that they're for anything except rigging the rules for the giant corporations and billionaires that fund their campaigns and hire them at lucrative, obscene reward salaries after they leave office, Johnson said. Thus, the effort is now on to defeat this treaty in Congress. Majorities in the House and Senate agreed to the fast-track process that keeps the treaty from being amended by Congress, and that raises the political stakes of a no vote, Johnson noted. But opponents argue that the consequences to U.S. citizens, as workers, as consumers, as people concerned about protecting the environment, and as people who care not only about their own rights and dignity, but those of workers around the world, raise the stakes even higher and make a no vote imperative. We might add that the U.S. trade representatives also are negotiating with nations in the European Union on a proposed transatlantic trade and investment partnership, which is believed to be along the same lines as the TPP. In conclusion, the Trans-Pacific Partnership is not a good deal for Main Street America. It's not a good deal for American workers or farmers or ranchers, and it won't stop the erosion of our middle class. It is a good deal for bankers, financial services, and multinational corporations who are constantly scanning the horizons to find cheaper places to manufacture their goods that they can import back into the U.S. to sell at Walmart. President Obama should have walked away from this deal. None of the three leading Democratic presidential candidates for president support it. We don't anticipate that any of the 13 Senate Democrats who sided with 48 Republicans to fast-track consideration of the trade deal in May will advertise their support of the deal when they run for re-election. Democrats as well as Republicans who claim to stand up for working people, the Constitution, and American sovereignty should vote it down. Thank you. And now, if you have any questions, I'd be glad to try to answer them.
You mentioned the Washington Post articles the other day. Do you think this is a break for us with the and even though it doesn't seem as if McConnell and Hatch are doing it for the right reasons, that there's a possibility that it can be defeated?
Well, sometimes you have to make an alliance with your lesser enemies to defeat the bigger enemy. And I think what we'll probably see is a lot of juggling to see who can avoid voting for it in the final vote, but still have it pass. And I think that's what happened in the fast track vote. Ted Cruz talks a good game, but he ended up voting for this bill. He might be able to dodge it in the next round, but really this next round is not as important as the fast track vote. That's really the et tu brute vote.
You made a very compelling case that we should not have a TPP. Who do we as individual citizens contact or lobby to push, to get this stopped? Who would you recommend we focus on?
Well, I would contact your Congress member, even if he's a Republican. I think you should call him up and say, how come you voted to give that Kenyan dictator Obama authority to negotiate away our freedoms? Vote no Obama trade, and make Lamar Smith and Mike McCall and some of those other charlatans explain away that vote.
Generally, I have a lot of respect for Obama. I think he's a compassionate, knowledgeable person. I mean, what is his rationale? I mean, I don't have a problem with the rest of the world becoming, better endowed, but I'm concerned. It seemed like there was a period of time a few years back, every time I turned on the radio, it'd be X number of thousands of Americans laid off from this or that company. It's like, what's the deal with Obama, and what are the alternatives, to help the rest of the world, but also try to help our own people?
Well, it's possible that Obama really believes that this is I think he probably does believe that some kind of trade deal is inevitable, and this is the best that he could produce. But I just don't agree. He probably came under intense pressure, but we know when he was running for election, he expressed skepticism about these kind of trade deals. He knows what the problem is and what the problem was under NAFTA. And his assurances notwithstanding, it doesn't appear like there are really enforceable standards for health, environment, and labor rights. We hardly have labor rights in the United States, much less some of these third world nations. Who are we kidding? So it's just a case of, you can grant him that maybe he means well, but that still doesn't make him right on this issue.
Hi, Carol Patterson. Actually, she sort of took my question. I had two questions, though. So you pretty much answered that. I guess with Obama, I'm thinking back on what he often says is that's the best he could do, because like you say, it's going through, so he tried to, with his power, manipulate it to be better than it might have been. Though, just piggybacking on what you said, I remember when he ran for office, he was opposed to NAFTA. I thought, wow. And then in short order, he changed once he was in power. So, my other question, though, which I got here late anyway, but with South America, didn't they want to push through a similar treaty, whatever it's called, agreement with South America? And didn't they say no to us? This is as opposed to NAFTA, which is Mexico, of course.
Yeah, I think, we have a treaty with Colombia and with Central American countries. But, I think maybe Brazil and Argentina declined.
My question is, in American foreign policy,
my experience from reading and from working for the Department of Defense overseas is that there's a military economic marriage in promoting opening markets and establishing multinational opportunities for large corporations to grab everything they can. So is the TPP affiliated somehow, in your opinion, with our pivot to Asia?
Well, yeah, I think at one point they were talking about how it was a means for these Asian countries to counter the Chinese hegemony. But now China is talking about trying to get into the TPP. So, but I think you may be right that a lot of people in Washington believe that lowering these trade standards will knit the global economy together and make it harder for one nation to get bellicose and risk losing their business advantage.
Do we have a possibility of developing a strong Buy American movement, or is it really going to be so hard to tell where various components of imported goods are made that it would make it very difficult to do that?
Well, yeah, that's part of the problem is that it's hard to tell what is American anymore. If you try to find American-made clothing, it can be a real struggle. And some of these deals do prohibit Buy American on the government level because that's considered a subsidy of American producers. And foreign manufacturers can sue if we have a Buy American program because they can lose anticipated profits, and that the lawsuit would be heard by that independent tribunal, of which one member is named by the government that's being sued. One member is named by the plaintiff, and then the third member of the tribunal is by mutual agreement of the two parties. And even if, we could anticipate that a current president might take an aggressive stance to defend our local sovereignty, who knows what a future president might do. So we just have no assurances that American interests will be protected in the future.
Do these trade agreements have any kind of a sunset provision where they have to either be reauthorized that would give opportunities for some of these huge negative impacts to be corrected in future amendments or that type of thing, or did they just go on till the end of the earth, which may be pretty soon?
No, I don't think there's a sunset provision for these pacts because they're so difficult to get together. Nobody wants to risk having to do this again. They've been doing this. They've been negotiating this for a dozen years, and finally got something together. And they don't want to go through that again. On the other hand, it seems like since they insist that this is not a treaty, a majority rule of Congress could get us out of any of these trade agreements.
Thank you. So with this new climate agreement that was passed in Paris, there's great hope that we can actually address carbon going into the atmosphere. However, I'm afraid with some of the ability of corporations to sue, if their profit is diminished by regulations because of this new agreement, would we actually be able to envision passing laws that would diminish carbon because the corporations would just sue us because we're cutting into their profits, which is how I understand this trade agreement would work.
Yeah. Well, under the climate agreement, it sounds like President Obama has agreed to do things that basically he can accomplish by executive order, since the Republican-dominated Congress has made it clear they're not going to put up with any of this. So any future administration, of course, can turn around and drop those policies. But yes, any environmental rules that impact on profit can be challenged to this arbitration panel. Now, it would probably have to be an environmental rule that was lower than the least, or higher than the least common denominator of all the countries in the pact, but that probably wouldn't be hard to attain.
Okay. I was just thinking to piggyback on what Clive said. I was in Australia and then later Bali a year and a half ago, and in Bali these big buses would go through with Chinese people, and in a little hotel I stayed in, which was very Indonesian style, Balinese. Chinese group came in and they started screaming that we had all of these reservations. We want all these, they're like little houses, and how could you not give them to us? Well, they prevailed. Somehow they got all this accommodation. And when I got back, I wrote a letter to President Obama, although I never mailed it, saying that I could foresee militarily a huge problem in that neck of the woods. The Chinese are in many, many countries, and they feel like, they're the dominant, and superior force. They really do. And so when I heard that he had created some type of treaty with the Philippines militarily, I thought, well, thank God for that. But what Clive said, I think, could be spot on in terms of what Obama's thinking. If he makes them very strong and economic ties really powerful, knitting it that way, then militarily we'll have less to worry about, because the Chinese do have more boots on the ground than any nation in the world. And I think we need to be aware of their mindset, which is much different than ours. And they do sort of feel in Asia that is their territory. That's their land, in a sense.
Well, yes, and they're trying to assert their control over the South China Sea and building up those islands so they can expand their international waters. And President Obama has tried to challenge their assertion of those rights. But and that is one of the arguments in favor of this pact, is that it would try to expand the economy and make any economic conflicts rather than military.
You mentioned the possibility that China would try to get in this. What do you think the likelihood of that is?
Well, since it was originally envisioned as a way to control China's expansion, I'm not sure how many of the signatories would really want China involved. But they seem to accept the fact that China is the 800-pound gorilla in the neighborhood, and it might be better if China were in the treaty, since they're going to be involved one way or the other.
Jim, I'm very worried about safety of our food and our drugs. We've seen so many instances of contaminated foods coming in from other countries. And what's the role of our Food and Drug Administration in this situation?
Well, that remains to be seen. But the Congress is not interested in expanding them. And the cutting budgets of a lot of these regulatory agencies. We'd like to think that they're keeping an eye on these things, but then some of these corporations can sue if we hold up their food shipments, what they considered an unwarranted length of time. We've got a limited number of USDA inspectors that can inspect food at the border with Mexico. That's been a problem. Backlogs of Mexican produce shipments. And now if we have the same thing in the western seaports, that could be another cause of litigation. But I wouldn't anticipate that Congress will increase the number of inspectors at USDA or the FDA.
Thank you. I always have questions. I'd like you to elaborate, if you could, on sort of the relative hierarchy of the TPP and things like the U.S. Constitution and our internal laws. I'm not sure how something like TPP can trump the Constitution of this country.
Yeah, that's a little bit of a conundrum. And I believe there was a lawsuit filed when NAFTA was passed challenging its constitutionality, and I think the Supreme Court refused to hear it. I don't know on what grounds, but it does seem like you can't negate the Constitution on a majority vote of Congress. Yeah. So, but trying to get the Supreme Court convinced of that is another matter.
Well, from my perspective, and I'm certainly not a legal scholar, we have antitrust laws in this country. We have laws against conspiracy and restraint of trade. We're supposed to be protected from giant monopolies, but it's almost sounding as if this partnership is establishing giant monopolies. Is there any remedy for that, or are our laws no longer applicable?
Well, we effectively stopped enforcing the Antitrust Act under the Reagan administration, and you know, we've seen monopolies grow ever since then. Occasionally, I know the Obama administration has objected to some mergers, which would further entrench monopolies, particularly in the cable industry and a few other cases. But it does encourage the huge multinationals, gives them more power to overwhelm the national regulators.
And do you see this as jeopardizing our national security?
Well, yeah. When we can't build a computer anymore without China's cooperation, I mean, they're building the computers. We make some. I think we still make some of the ingredients here in the United States and in Austin, but your smartphones, I mean, when we lose the ability to manufacture an entire car in the United States, will we be able to manufacture a tank or a missile?
I'm trying to find something good about this agreement, and I think I have a suggestion. What if one of our trade partners is shipping goods to, say, to the West Coast or the East Coast, and because of our deteriorating infrastructure, their stuff gets delayed, and then they can sue the federal government for not upgrading its infrastructure. Maybe that would be a way to get something positive out of this thing and force improved highways so they can get their products to market. Maybe this would be a roundabout way of pushing our Congress to do what they should have done 15 or 20 years ago. I'm trying to find something good.
Well, that's creative thinking, and at least we are getting some Republicans to agree with Obama, so that's something.
Oh, I just want to follow up on my previous question. It seems to me there's some Republican opposition to this now, with McConnell and the man from Utah whose name just escaped me, Orrin Hatch. Did you say that you didn't think that was going to go anywhere and that it was going to pass anyway?
I think they'll just patch up 51 votes somewhere to pass the bill in the Senate. I think the House is the most realistic place to try to stop it, because there are enough crazy Republicans in the House that might appeal to the what are you doing handing these powers to Obama argument.
Oh, okay. That's a good idea.
One of the things that worries me also is, and this has been brought up kind of tangentially, I guess, is quality control in manufacture, like in computers and components for tanks and so forth. What do we do under this agreement? Is there any kind of strict monitoring of quality control built in?
I don't know if that is addressed.
So there was also questions about internet access and freedom related to this trade agreement. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, there has been some suggestion that net neutrality might be objectionable under this treaty because it prohibits cable companies from squeezing every last dollar they can get out of cable subscribers in refusing to allow them to charge extra for higher speed or unlimited access. So it just presents a whole shelf full of cans of worms to be opened up.
Would you elaborate a little bit? You said something about there might be a problem with if we're trying to do a Made in America thing. Would the government be sued over that, or could individuals be sued over that, or small groups, whatever?
Well, yeah, whoever is trying to promote Made in America, well, it would be government most likely. I mean, you would be free to try to buy American goods if you can find them. But, for example, local governments might be prohibited from restricting public works projects to American products. I know there were challenges when they were rebuilding the San Francisco Bay Bridge because they wanted to get American steel, and the Chinese objected under the WTO that they ought to be able to bid on the project too. I can't remember how that was resolved, but that's the sort of thing that would come up because that would be considered protective trade barriers.
How is Europe responding to this, both collectively as the EU and some of the individual nations?
Well, they're a little more protective of their rights to regulate, I think, than some of these countries are. I mean, they've been protective of the right to label GMO foods, for example, genetically modified foods. But, they're already in the WTO, and the WTO seems to have ruled that genetic modification labels are forbidden. So I think we'd have to assume that they would go along with the same kind of principles.
It's probably more a comment because of you mentioning San Francisco. I'm sort of from San Francisco, although I've not been there recently. And then apropos of the question by Bonnie, what I heard about the Bay Bridge is that they had used Chinese materials and they were below quality and it was falling apart.
Yeah.
And I laughed at that because I thought that was so wrong not to get American. And apparently the response of San Francisco was America no longer can produce those things, which is sort of apropos of what you were saying earlier. So we have a problem.
Well, I think America can produce those things, but not at the cost that Chinese and Koreans can produce it.
Hello again. My response is to the issue of the bridge building. My family all lives up in Tacoma, Washington, and there's a bridge there called the Tacoma Narrows Bridge. And the single bridge that existed for a long time wasn't enough to handle the traffic between Tacoma and the area around Bremerton and the Kitsap Peninsula. And so there was a second bridge put up. And there was a tremendous struggle in Washington with the labor councils in Washington and the governor before Jay Inslee there to try to get Washington labor and Washington materials used there. And a company in Tacoma named Concrete Technology has built similar bridges in other parts of the world, but was not able to successfully bid on the bridge in Tacoma because it was built in Korea, in South Korea, and part of it, I understand, I don't know whether this is just inaccurate or not, but some of the materials had to be
purchased through China and North Korea in order to build the bridge parts in South Korea. Then they were brought over on barges, and they were lifted up and suspended from the rigging by a Japanese company. And so essentially now it's not known as locally as the Tacoma Narrows Bridge, it's the South Korean bridge. And so, yes, the issue with the bridge in San Francisco is true, and it is certainly a race to the bottom, because there were people that I grew up with that worked at Concrete Technology, that was kind of their last option before they hit the skids, and that kind of finished them off.
And it would be harder for local governments or state governments to keep those Buy American provisions under this pact. And back to the quality control question, it's harder to guarantee quality control if you have to constantly monitor these plants in China, Korea, Malaysia, wherever they are. It's hard enough to monitor plants here in the United States.
Right. Well, following up on this issue of quality and control and quality in construction, wouldn't it be very difficult to pursue any liability cases if, you had this tangled web of different companies producing a product? What happens to product liability issues? I don't know if of course, with 1,000 pages, it's awfully hard to know if what's been addressed in there and what hasn't.
Yeah.
Do you get into international law problems there, and what average citizen can afford to take on something like that?
Yeah, I expect that this will be a boom for international trade lawyers, and I would guess that any product liability lawsuits would be heard in the nation where the product was made. Which, good luck with that.
Yeah. Well, this almost sounds like a wholesale giveaway in many respects.
Well, I wouldn't want to editorialize. But
Thank you, Bonnie. I've seen in the business journals and Wall Street Journal in recent months and years that low-cost labor is actually moving away from China to places like Vietnam or Myanmar or other places in Southeast Asia. Are some of the smaller countries in Southeast Asia involved in the TPP, or do you expect that will be the case?
Well, Vietnam is, and it is designed for some of the smaller countries, and this will present a challenge to China. Because they've had trouble sustaining their growth, and when you've got 1.5 billion people, they're riding the tiger. And the same thing could happen that happened in Mexico. You get all these people displaced, and where are they going to go?
And at what point does this actually become a more costly proposal to us than had originally been intended? Costly in many different respects. Would you comment on that?
Well, it's almost certain that it'll cost a lot more than it's promised. If past performance is an indicator of future.
Would you take just about 3 minutes or so and make a closing statement for us?
Well, as I said earlier, you can believe in the President's goodwill in negotiating this, but you should count on the moneyed interests having their way if they can. And the best we can do is to try to assert the people's will in whichever way we can, and the best opportunity for that is to try to stop it in the House. I think there are enough interests in the Senate. You've got people like Wyden and Patty Murray who are on the West Coast and states that are heavily dependent on trade with Asia, and I'm sure they've come under intense weight from people like Boeing and other large employers in their area, Nike, Microsoft, whatever, to expand these trade provisions. So, like I said, they'll find 51 votes in the Senate. It's a matter of hoping that the anti-Obama fervor in the House will be enough to, with the solid number of progressive Democrats. The fast track was passed, I think, with 28 Democratic votes. So if the Democrats hold their numbers and get maybe 50 or 60 Republicans, they might be able to win it.
Well, Jim, did you bring some copies of the Progressive Populist? And I'm sure this issue must be discussed in your newspaper.
Oh, yeah, we bandy about it. And there are some copies in the last pew on this side, along with some brochures.
Okay, are those free samples?
Yeah, free samples. And,
okay, so on the way out, avail yourself of one of those. And we want to thank you, Jim, for explaining something that's extremely complicated to us and maybe allowing us to strategize and figure out some kind of more reasoned stand on this issue and how we might organize to ensure that it's a better deal for us than maybe it seems at present.
Yeah.
Let's give Jim a big hand. Thank you.
And if I haven't befuddled you with enough details already, go to Global Trade Watch at publiccitizen.org, I think is the website, or the AFL-CIO, of course, will give you plenty of fulmination about all these trade provisions.
Thank you. And thank you for closing out our 2015 Forum Series.